Welcome. We are here today and we have our guest speaker, Dr. Sheron Fraser-Burgess from Ball State University. She's a professor of multicultural education. And we are going to be talking about W.E.B. Du Bois, famous African-American intellectual, and his book, The Souls of Black Folk. And this is a part of a series that we're doing here at Muncie Public Library for Black History Month. And so I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Fraser-Burgess and let her have it. And I think we're all going to have a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this book. I will share my screen with you. So welcome. I'm so pleased that you decided to join us, and I'm excited to discuss the book with you. And so I have a presentation, but this presentation is not meant to be a lecture. It's actually intended to be interactive, and so feel free to indicate that you would like to comment in some way along the way. However, I will definitely towards the end be asking you to share your insights from the book. So what a towering figure we're addressing today in the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. And The Souls of Black Folk, of course, comes very early in his work. And so we're actually going to be focusing on the early part of his career. So let me just be sure, are you seeing right now the title slide of this presentation?
Yep.
All right, so as you said, as we mentioned, he's a towering force in terms of his political and academic influence in the movement for Black equality. His intellectual achievements notably included being the first African-American or Black person to graduate from Harvard. He received a PhD in sociology and history. And he also was an academic fairly early on, beginning with his work at Wilberforce University, even before he graduated with his PhD, then doing pretty systematic and intense sociological research, data collection, if you will, at the University of Pennsylvania, and then really starting his first professional appointment as an academic at Atlanta University, where he famously had 2 stints. There are, of course, quite a few different works for which he's known, including the one we are examining today. But another notable work would be the Black Reconstruction in America, and also the Black Flame trilogy. Another component of his life is, as I mentioned, he was not only an academic, but he was also an activist and a public intellectual. And so he's known for being one of the founders of the Niagara movement, as well as the organization evolved into being the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This is a very sensitive computer. And he also was someone who was known for organizing several Pan-African congresses. I see a hand from Molly.
Yeah, well, I just want to know what the Niagara movement was. Was that with Frederick Douglass and I'm guessing here.
So these were a movement very early. So they, it predated the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it was a movement of sort of Black intellectuals as well as sort of white liberals who wanted to fight for and advocate for Black rights at a time in 1905 was a time when the Jim Crow laws, had truly spawned the KKK movement, or the burgeoning KKK movement. And so it was a critical time. And so the Niagara movement was kind of the precursor to the NAACP. So follow it then. So who was he? I mean, just in I thought it was some interesting details to note in his biography. He was born in Massachusetts, but he was actually the son of an immigrant. His father was born in Haiti and came to the United States when he was 5 years old. His grandfather married a mulatto in Haiti and brought Alfred Du Bois to the United States, and they settled in Massachusetts. And even at that time, in the sort of mid to late 1800s, Du Bois attended predominantly white elementary and high schools. And then he attended and graduated from Fisk University. And he was such a good student, or received such a great education in Massachusetts, that he actually started his college as a sophomore. So just in terms of background and in what was happening at the time The Souls of Black Folk was written in 1903, we're dealing with the after effects, as I said, at the end of Reconstruction. So after the Civil War ended, as you all know, there was this time when the nation was tasked with integrating into society, these individuals who had been, for the most part, in chattel slavery. And so this difficult time, which he documents in The Souls of Black Folk, that was overseen by the Freedmen's Bureau. And again, as an administrative entity, it struggled to define itself and made several crucial tactical errors that eventually led to its dissolution. But so imagine, if you will, that Du Bois was coming of age at this time, and with a sort of emerging sociologist's eye to observing what was unfolding. And so he, going to school in the South as an educated Black person, and surrounded by individuals who, so little investment had been made in their education. And he was also seeing the growth of white supremacy. So much of what he was observing in this time of transition, particularly because the end of Reconstruction meant that there was the return of slavery in every way except by law. And so this is what he was capturing in the account. So he was a very prolific author, as I mentioned, and these are just a list of some of the works that emerged during that crucial time in the early years, early work as an academic, that are worth knowing. And some of these titles are ones that today we identify as defining the discourse about Black liberation and African-American studies as it came to be known. Particularly in thinking about the meaning of race and what, how do we view race? Do we want to retain this construct that has sort of origins in sort of white supremacy in the United States context, or do we want to, do away with it? And as you know, as you probably know, Du Bois was a conservationist. He believed that more was to be gained by holding on to the construct of race as sort of an organizing idea. And he felt that there was the potential for it to be generative for Black people, although for whites, it would be a much different task of reckoning with the sort of phenotype. And also, even in his early work, you see him being sort of, a very disciplined sociologist. That he was one who was had a keen eye for observation, for systematic sort of studying of phenomena and capturing it in a way that theoretically was explanatory. So we see that that scholar very very early on. Much of what I've mentioned, sort of captured in these pictures. The version that I have here is an electronic version. Was published in 1903. It's a version of the actual book that was published in 1903 and reprinted by Oxford University Press. And as you know, the structure is very simple. There's a preface, 14 chapters, and an afterword. And these pictures represent the salient sort of material factors that were influencing strongly his work. There was the fact that the primary transition occupationally for former sort of participants in or just members in chattel slavery was to go to sharecropping. That in many cases they did not go very far from the very location geographically that they were slaves, and then became sharecroppers, which sort of consigned them to a life of indebtedness. But we know later on that there was this movement of the Great Migration, which was, a social resistance to this fate. And of course, the Freedmen's Bureau, which, loomed large in that transition, the increasing visibility of the violence of white supremacists, and then Booker T. Washington, who sort of was his foil, in many different ways in at that time. So this is an outline of the chapters of the book. So the sections are ones that I sort of imposed on them, and the themes, I think, tried to capture the chapters themselves. So in chapter 1, we see the defining conflict that he identifies. And in chapter 2, his sense that the failure of the Freedmen's Bureau was not just an administrative failure or a political failure, it was a moral failure. And so it was, in a sense, a betrayal of the hopes of these former slaves. Then in chapter 3, Booker T. Washington, his promise of education was problematic. What kind of education and for what purpose? Those are two contested questions. And in the subsequent chapters, in chapter 4, 5, and to some extent, mainly, yes, 4 and 5, is the veil-defined life, where he talks about African Americans essentially living life in the veil. And in 3 chapters, he accounts the montage of Black misery and capturing that for us to really understand what life was like. And then, providing facets of Black life and culture, and including his relationship with Alexander Cromwell. So that's the basic outline of those chapters. So I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking with you, or just talking about chapter 1, and where he frames this idea of the double consciousness. And in doing so is giving a historiography of the Black struggle for equal rights. And for us, it's the beginning stage. And essentially is representing the Black existential condition in terms of their status in the United States, but also the sense of their worth, right? The sense of their status as human beings. And that very much so, it seemed as if they had attained equal status by virtue of the 13th Amendment in ending slavery and the 14th Amendment giving them equal protection, but that they, in a sense, people's hearts and minds, particularly in the South, and some would even argue in the North, had not moved beyond seeing them as less than equal to white citizens. So Du Bois framed this existential question of, how does it feel to be a problem? And that although arguably African-Americans at that time, Black people, even we'll say Negroes, as they would have called themselves, did not choose for the most part to be in the condition in which they found themselves. Yet, as a trait of this issue that would be repeated through American history, they became identified with a problem they did not create. So many of the logistical and social and economic challenges of integrating them into society became a statement not about their condition, but a statement about them. And when we remember that, for the most part, it had been illegal to educate the former slaves. So we had the problem of illiteracy. And many of the conditions in which they lived were really in degradation, not getting access to the basic components of sanitation. And so despite the fact that they did not create the conditions, as I said, of trying to integrate them into society, the problems of doing so became continuous with being Black. And so they became a problem. So looking at this, look at this quote that I have here, and it's actually from page 8, just in case I'm having, oops. You might want to stop the recording just a minute as I try to figure out what happened here to my PowerPoint.
It's okay. These things will be edited.
Okay, good.
So you're fine.
All right. So as we look at that quote, how does it feel to be a problem as it relates to, as it relates to page 8 of this chapter 1, we can certainly just take a minute and read it. He says, after the Egyptian and the Indian, I'll go back to the screen here. After the Egyptian and the Indian, the Greek and the Roman, I can read it from the book. Or if you find that, please feel free to go ahead and read it for me. You can read the quote, if you can see the quote on your computer.
Yes, we can see it.
All right, please read it. Someone can read it out loud for us.
Okay, I can do that.
Thank you.
After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, one ever feels this two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two reconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder.
Mhm. So just thinking about that passage, what are you hearing and how do you see this as a description of sort of the Black consciousness?
I feel that this is a very complex concept that I think that many people would have difficulty fully understanding. I feel that I myself, I don't understand it entirely. I feel like this is a concept that can only truly be understood if you are Black and in America.
Mm-hmm.
And while at the same time, I feel that I am incapable of understanding it. It is not required that I understand it for me to appreciate the complexity of it.
Mm-hmm.
And this was something that when I was looking at this book and deciding whether or not we would read it, I was aware of this concept that he would pontificate on, this
Mm-hmm.
double consciousness. And I was really interested in it and hoping to understand it better.
Okay, thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right that it is complex, has many different components, and it raises the question of whether someone could identify with this state or if that person were not a Black person in America. But perhaps it's worthwhile to try to unpack it to some extent to identify the components at the very least. And then an additional sort of leap would be to be able to relate to that conflict. So before we dive into sort of unpacking this quote, I do want to reference Frantz Fanon and his idea of the white normative gaze. And I think that's helpful because it firstly identifies who the observer is. And the observer is a white agent. And if you consider what that would mean in the time of Du Bois, relative to a Black person in the South, there could be many attributes that you could infer to this, to whiteness being occupied by an individual, but more as a sort of position in the world, right? Whiteness would be the landowner with the power to purchase a slave or sell a slave, to command authority, to administer punishment, to take one's child. And even after the end of the 13th Amendment, after the 13th Amendment, of course, was passed, in places like Texas, for some 2 years later, slavery was still practiced. So one's status as a white person gave that this power, this privilege, this authority. So Fanon talked about the white gaze, but then there's this notion of the normative gaze, which I think is further predicates or further elaborates on this idea of how whiteness can function. It doesn't have to function this way, but the notion of the normative gaze is to suggest that not only is one being observed, meaning one is an object, but that one is an object that is being evaluated by this norm. We might want to talk about what that norm is. But clearly it's a standard, it's a criteria, it's a set of criteria, and then there will be the gaze. And the gaze, of course, it's fixing on you. And depending on the situation, just think about what it means to be observed. Oh, I see that Elizabeth has her hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really interested in unpacking this quote, and I'm so glad that you are able to join us and share your expertise on this. What was interesting to me about the quote is the idea of the second sight, where he's positing that as an African American in the United States of America, he's part of two worlds, right? The dominant culture and then himself, right? And how this is and the challenge of this, and I think that this two-ness in some ways may be an Americanness, because we are not a country that was founded by a tribe, right? There are many countries that are like tribal countries, whatever. Many European countries even, sort of have kind of a root where roots where everyone in the country has the same shared culture or background, and like by definition, like our country is not that. And then to a great extent in the modern world, probably many countries aren't that anymore. And that's what's intriguing to me about this quote, is how he's describing his experience specifically as an African American man with the dominant culture being sort of white America, but like for many, maybe it's could also be understood as being having the two-ness of being an outsider and an insider. And I recognize that sort of depending on what culture one is in, it's easier to pretend to be an insider even when one is not an insider, right? That if you look like the inside, you can fake the inside. But I think all of us feel like outsiders at some point, and all of us are outsiders in some way because we're individuals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I hear you saying that the American culture can lend itself to any individual feeling alien within it, right? Depending on the sense in which one feels as the minority to a dominant culture. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yes, and also the idea, because what he compares it to, right? The Egyptian, the Greek, the Roman, these are like sort of cultures and civilizations that were also like tribes, right? Like I don't know if I'm using the right word, but like, it was not just a shared culture and tradition, it was a shared heritage and, ancestry. And that kind of isn't the model of the United States, and probably isn't the model of most modern countries anymore. Mm-hmm. Right. But at one point, like that's what nationhood was it wasn't just a shared set of like values in government, but it might have also been a shared cultural and ancestral tradition. Mm-hmm. Right. Like that's just not, so I think I'm still forming these words as I spit them out, but this is fascinating. I really appreciate the opportunity to dive into this and think about it.
Mm-hmm. I like what you said, particularly in trying to find a point of connection with what is in a sense a dilemma, right? It is this crisis. It's existential in terms of what it means to exist as a Black person, but it's also ontological, because one sees oneself in two ways. You both see yourself, and then you see others seeing you. So you mentally have these two images, occupying different realms of your consciousness. One is who am I, who I take myself to be, and as well, who others take me to be. And if the question is, who is this person that others take the Black person to be, in such a way that, as Du Bois said, it can tear the Black person asunder. he says, two warring ideals in one body, in one dark body. And there is a sense of it being torn asunder. So what, when I think of ideal, I think of something that is desirable, but that is not always the case. It depends on who is desiring it. An aspiration ideal might be violent. And so there's a sense that the two thoughts are in conflict with each other.
Yeah, well, I think what you're kind of alluding to and what he's getting at is that, for him as he would describe himself a Negro, or, an African-American today, like the ideal that is coming from others is probably very different from the ideal that's coming from within, and maybe like an ideal that he doesn't even want, right? And I think that's, what I think about, like, in the kind of more broad, like when I'm trying to broaden it out and connect, it's like many of the ways that I might want to go against society's ideals, right? Like my haircut or something, like are more acceptable to the rest of society than maybe the ways he wanted to go against.
Mm-hmm.
And just and more desirable to me, right? That, like, that it's those two things. It's like that, like you were saying, what is being imposed upon the self that is being imposed and the self that's coming from within. It's not just like the fact that they're different. It's also like the very quality and nature and enforcement of them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm hearing all these things that you're talking about, and I really enjoy them. I really like the part of the paragraph that says, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. And I feel that sort of resonates with a concept that I have always held, and maybe you can speak to this, Sharon, that I feel that what's different about, in America, we are the melting pot and we all come from other places, unless you're Native American. But like being a descendant of a slave, of a Black slave, as opposed to being a Russian American or a Swedish American or an Irish American or a Chinese American, is that all of these other groups of people have their culture and have their ancestry, and they, in many cases, are able to trace back their ancestry to the person who got off the boat and got them here in our land. And they are able to research their languages and their cultures and such, where I feel is predominantly in the Black American culture as it is today. They were robbed of that, and that many people don't know exactly where in Africa they came from, what group of people, what languages they spoke, what religion they had, their stories, their folklore, their culture is predominantly lost to them and such. And so I feel like that stealing of an identity now is forcing him, that he is saying, I have to see myself as other people define me, because I have been robbed of the ability to define myself because my heritage has been taken from me.
That's a great point. Thank you for that. Haley, I see your hand is up. Someone else, and then Molly.
So I guess what struck me most about this quote is the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others while also being evaluated by the world at all times. And although I don't think there's a one-to-one comparison at all, the concept reminded me a lot of the male gaze, whereas in a lot of women tend to, we're so used to being viewed that we have thus gotten used to not only being viewed, but to viewing ourselves the way other people might view us, and the toll that can kind of take over time when you're just constantly being a mirror to yourself. And I think that I think that's a very common experience of people who are disenfranchised in general to just constantly being view yourself as being viewed. Only I think with the experience of a white woman, that experience might only be one of being sexualized, whereas obviously as a Black man, you're going to be viewed as, more of a threat. So you have to evaluate what your body language is conveying so that you don't accidentally get viewed as a threat, and then thus have a threat against you. And of course, there's the intersection that Black women have, where I suppose both experiences sort of combine into one intersectionally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that point, Haley. Molly?
So first of all, my kids are in the other room, so if they're loud, I'm sorry.
You're fine. You're fine.
No, I was actually going to say the same thing Haley did, so she pretty much touched on it, which reminds me of the. I know it via Beyonce because of her album, but the Malcolm X quote about how hard it is, how the most disrespected person in America is a Black woman, because you have that double gaze.
Mm-hmm.
The white gaze and the male gaze. But I can definitely identify with that. You only seeing yourself through the revelation of the other world because it's just ingrained. Although I feel like one thing though that I'm interested. One thing I think is particularly poignant about this is the two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals. And I feel as though it must be one of those things though, for particularly Du Bois at the time, because he was honestly so well educated that you want to, I guess everybody at the time who was Black, but having the feeling of like, you ultimately want to succeed in the world. You were given the set of circumstances, you want to overcome them, you want to succeed in it, but there has to be a huge part of you that just wants to tear it down. You know what I mean? And doesn't want to succeed in it. You want to scrap it all because it all is angled against you. And I feel like the rest of the book, of course, gets into all of this in much deeper detail, but that those two warring ideals, I can see how that could lead to, as you suggested, to violence among each other, among ourselves, and yet at the same time that striving, which was, as he demonstrates throughout the book, all but impossible to find achievement. I'm not talking very well. I know that's all I got.
No, you absolutely no. You both you and Haley and you underscore the psychological really stress, and he does talk about that later on. And other psychologists like Claude Steele talked about the stereotype threat in terms of the psychic sort of toll that it takes on one to be in that space of this two-ness. And the Claude Steele's stereotype threat is this idea that African Americans underperform when they have a sense that there's a low expectation for performance on a test. And so that's, and also Bell Hooks talked about this idea of spectatorship, which is a modern interpretation of the same idea that you are aware of being an object, and that takes a toll on your psychologically having to reckon with being an object in addition to performing. And so there's that additional component to this two-ness, that it does affect your performance. And he goes on to talk about how that affects, the artisan and the doctor, that despite our best effort, it's not always possible to put out of mind this idea that we are being evaluated. We're an object. We're not a subject indifferent when you walk into a situation, but we are an object. We're being evaluated. We're being scrutinized, and it is in the male gaze based on patriarchy, and then the white gaze based on white supremacy, and so those two converging sources of scrutiny can be very debilitating to one's performance. So, but are there any questions that you'd want to ask, though, not that we can answer them, but if you could talk to Du Bois and about this passage now. Are there any questions that come to mind? And we don't have to answer them. We could just sort of mention them. Any questions you would ask if you could of Du Bois? All right, none? Okay. So let's go on to the next chapter, which is chapter 2. I'm still talking, well, the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau. And so this committee this relates to the Act of 1866, which gave the Freedmen's Bureau its final form. And as we know, the history of the Freedmen's Bureau is one that is pretty complicated. As it unfolded, by the time it was finally established, went about its work, it was productive, right? But eventually, corruption or not following the letter of the law led to this organization being eventually defunded and not being allowed to complete its work. So that is the story that's mentioned. But we can certainly look at that chapter. And are there any observations that we'd want to make about the fate of this bureau? Oh, is that, I'm sorry, I have chapter 2, The Dawn of Freedom, right? Oh, yes, that's right. So he says, the problem of the 20th century, that's another famous quote, that's right. So the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, he says, and the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, that's the starting of chapter 2, and the islands of the sea, as I continue to read. It was a phase of this problem that caused the Civil War, and however much they who marched the South and North in 1861 may have fixed on the technical points of union and local autonomy as shibboleth, all nevertheless knew, as we know, that the question of Negro slavery was the real cause of conflict. And so this quote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. It's another famous sort of artifact from the souls of Black folk. And I'm interested in your sense that this through line still relates to life in the United States today. In a sense, he attributes the failure, right, of the Freedmen's Bureau to this notion that, yes, it wasn't well administered, but that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that there was this color line, and their attempt to blur the social categorization, the social distinctions, was actually the source of their failure. So I'm interested in this, this idea that even though there was the dawn of freedom with the Emancipation Proclamation and the movement towards implementing social programs to bridge the gap that was clearly there between the African Americans, newly freed, and reestablishing them. There was the promise of giving or providing 40 acres and a mule. There were efforts to initially take lands that were owned by slaveholders and give them to the former slaves. That was mysteriously scuttled. No one knows how that disappeared. We had the efforts of the slaves to save their money, and that also was thwarted by forces outside of their control. But all of this, in his view, was really indicative of the problem of the color line, that slavery had over the, since 1619, in this initial sort of, when Virginia first had the slaves, sort of were landed in the colony, and then the gradual creation of laws, in Virginia that would, ensure intergenerational slavery. By the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery was an institution, and it had these threads in American society. I think Annette Gordon Reed, who wrote the book on Sally Hemings, and Thomas Jefferson, again, a Virginian, talked about the close proximity in which slaveholders and slaves lived relationally, so that it was possible for Thomas Jefferson, after his wife died, to enter into this relationship with Sally and have Sally Hemings and have so many children, and that be sort of normal without there being much social rejection, or the mores of the society did allow for these kinds of sort of systematic rape, right? Non-consensual, mutually consensual relationships so closely intertwined, was slavery as part of Southern society. And so the color line had become very robust by the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Freedmen's Bureau undertook the social program to basically dissolve that line, and was not very successful. So in light of that, this occurring, this statement being made in 1903, and it is 2000, it is now 2022. To what extent would you say that this claim has proven to be an accurate sort of theorization of the sort of the existence of systematic racism in our society?
I don't know how to put up the little hand, but I will say that as one who grew up in the American South, I was born in 1948, and I'm 74 years old now, and except for 5 years, I lived in, well, I guess 6 now, but I've lived in Alabama all that time. And I think that statement, which he made in this book in 1903, certainly was true in the 20th century and continues to be true in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you, Bill. And so how do you see it unfolding as a ongoing problem today?
Well, I mean, when you have white supremacists in Charlottesville and you have a president who says there are good people on both sides, it seems to me the problem of the color line is still with us. And I wish it weren't, but it still is.
But if you would ask, President Trump and his supporters, they disavow the racism for the most part. And in fact, many of the anti-CRT bills, critical race theory bills that are making their way through, states explicitly advocate for treating, all people equally. So is this problem of the same form? And if not, how is it different? Haley?
Yeah, I would argue, based on this quote provided, that we still have a lot of the same issues. For instance, with our laws, it tends to be mostly not old, but it tends to be mostly white people making these laws. And and white people interpreting them. And a lot of laws are very punitive, of course, to Black people, such as with overly punitive drug laws for drugs that are harmless, as well as, you know, putting people in jail when they need to be receiving substance abuse treatment. So that's one way that, you know, the laws carry over, not to mention military force being used against citizens is something that we've seen during many Black Lives Matter protests, where people are, you know, just trying to peacefully protest for equality and for their rights. And then you have people coming in with massive firearms and shields, looking as though they were going into a war. So these are, you know, two ways where I see a parallel of then and now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, it's thinking about the ways in which we are the color line is reorganizing and sort of restructuring itself, but remaining firmly in place is an interesting sort of inquiry. So how are we seeing the color line unfold today? And how can we resist some of its forms that it's taking to, in a sense, to prevent us moving to a more perfect union, right? Because that can't happen unless, you know, a substantial portion of all citizens feel that they're truly, you know, able to be treated equally. And we're seeing that whether it's in law enforcement, in education, and other markers of social mobility, we're still having significant lags based on race. So one would say that that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a racist society, but it is at least gesturing to a systemic, some form of a systemic problem. Okay, and then moving to the next chapter, chapter 3 is where he really takes on Booker T. Washington and this notion of the Atlanta Compromise. And the Atlanta Compromise is actually based on a speech that Booker T. Washington gave at the Atlanta Exposition. And it's called the Atlanta Compromise speech. And I'm going to play an excerpt of it, and we're able to hear the voice of Booker T. Washington, and to sort of see what were some of the claims that Du Bois found so objectionable. The audio isn't the best, but hopefully you'll be able to understand.
If you've pulled up the video, I can't see it.
Oh, hold on.
Can't hear it either.
You can't see or hear. Thank you. I see what the problem is that I'm going to have to stop sharing, and thank you for letting me know, and do the sharing of my video screen. Just bear with me one moment. Here we go. And the transcript of the speech is listed here as well.
Yeah, I don't think we're hearing that.
You're not able to hear it?
No.
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Are you able to see the speech?
Yes, we
Yes.
can read it. Yeah, but we're not hearing it.
Oh, that is unfortunate. Let me put the link in the chat.
Okay.
So I will do that. Okay. So I sent that. And so maybe someone could click on it and we could play it if you are so inclined, and maybe then we could hear it.
Okay, let me try to see what I can do.
Okay.
And see if I can get this to work.
Mr. President and gentlemen of the Board of Directors.
There we go.
Thank you.
1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race. No enterprise seeks the material, civil, or moral welfare of this section can disregard this element of our population and reach the highest success. I will convey to you, Mr. President and Directors, the sentiment of the masses of my race when I say that in no way have the value and manhood of the American Negro been more fittingly and generously recognized than by the managers of this magnificent expedition at every stage of its progress. It is a recognition that will do more to cement the friendship of the two races than any occurrence since the dawn of our freedom. Now, not only this, but the opportunity here afforded will awaken among us a new era of industrial progress. Ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first years of our new life, we began at the top instead of the bottom. That a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill. That the political convention or stump speaking had more attraction than starting a dairy farm or a truck garden. A ship lost at sea for many days suddenly sighted a friendly vessel. From the mast of the unfortunate vessel was seen a signal: water, water, we die of thirst. The answer from the friendly vessel at once came back: cast down your bucket where you are. A second time, the signal, water, send us water, ran up from the distressed vessel and was answered: cast down your bucket where you are. A third and fourth signal for water was answered: cast down your bucket where you are. The captain of the distressed vessel at last, heeding the injunction, cast down his bucket, and it came up full of fresh, sparkling water from the mouth of the Amazon River. Those of my race who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land, or who underestimate the importance of cultivating friend relations, the Southern white man, who is their next door neighbor, I would say, cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down, making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom you are surrounded. Those of the white race who look to the incoming of those of foreign birth, trained, sung, and happy for the prosperity of the South, were I permitted, I would repeat what I have said to my own race: cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down among the 8 millions of Negroes who habit you know, whose fidelity and love you have tested in days when you have proved treacherous, been the ruin of your fireside. Cast down your bucket among these people who have, without strife and labor wars, tilled your fields, cleared your forests, builded your railroads and cities, brought forth treasures from the bowels of the earth, helped to make possible this magnificent representation of the progress of the South.
All right, thank you so much. If you would, well, it should stop. So that's an actual excerpt of the speech. It's not the entire speech. But I thought it was important to hear, you know, his own words. Has anybody heard this speech before? I don't want to presume that you had not.
No.
So what was Booker T's aspiration with that speech? What was he hoping to communicate, given the conditions as you see it? What did you take him to be saying? In the refrain, cast down your bucket where you are, which is really the heart of Booker T's objection to him, right? If you think about where they were, for the most part, in abject poverty, and still able to observe that their former owners, in many cases, had been able to wrangle their way back into their land ownership, their position of power. And so his cry was, look around and make the most of what you have. And Booker T took that, Du Bois took that to mean that essentially the education that he was advocating for them, the route he was advocating for Black people, was primarily through vocational education. But I think more problematic was that they would no longer provide sort of a political resistance to white supremacy, that they would vacate the role of opposition to social inequality. They would not make their relative position in society a point of contest. And in return, the white Southerners would, as they did with Booker T, they heavily funded him in creating the HBCUs. Tuskegee was one, just sort of came out of the effort. And so he was well funded by foundations with kind of a tacit agreement that if he would then channel this money into keeping what Du Bois would say, keeping Black people in their place and not challenge politically the racism, then they could perhaps achieve economic equality. Any comments on that before I put this poem? So in 1954, Dudley Randall wrote a poem to capture the conflict between Booker T and Du Bois. And he, in this poem, you're not able to see it, so I'll stop sharing and go to the power to that. Go to that screen. And this poem, with this dialogue between the two men, was intended to capture the give and take. And so maybe I'll read it, and what I would like you to think about is how it articulates Du Bois's objection. So it seems to me, said Booker T, it shows a mighty lot of cheek to study chemistry and Greek when Mr. Charlie needs a hand to hold the cotton on his land. And when Miss Anne looks for a cook, why stick your nose inside a book? I don't agree, said W.E.B. If I should have the drive to seek knowledge of chemistry or Greek, I'll do it. Charles and Miss can look another place for hand or cook. Some men rejoice in skill of hand and some in cultivating land, but there are others who maintain the right to cultivate the brain. It seems to me, said Booker T, that all you folks have missed the boat who shout about the right to vote and spend vain days and sleepless nights in uproar over civil rights. Just keep your mouths shut, do not grouse, but work and save and buy a house. I don't agree, said W.E.B. For what can property avail if dignity and justice fail? Unless you help to make the laws, they'll steal your house with trumped up claws. A rope's a tight, a fire hot, no matter how much cash you've got. Speak soft and try your little plan. But as for me, I'll be a man. It seems to me, said Booker T. I don't agree, said W.E.B. So what do you see? How do you see that poem capturing the competing themes of both men? Oh, Haley?
So based on this poem and what, the speech that we've talked about, it seems to me that Booker T. Washington was really advocating for, it's pretty much a pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality, which if you don't know, that's impossible. Whereas W.E. Du Bois seemed to be advocating for more systemic issues. And Booker T. Washington reminds me a lot of the idea of respectability politics, which I think has been shown time and time again to not really get us anywhere. And yet somehow that's what people keep pushing, especially those in power.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, Elizabeth?
Yeah, like Haley said, I think they were very opposing approaches. And in some ways, another way to think about them is kind of like working within the system versus working outside of the system, right? Baby steps versus giant leaps. And I think that what I loved about the poem, because it was so accessible. I love rhyming, it was great, right? But also sort of putting in opposition, working with your hands, cooking, doing the things of life and working with your brain. And I think that that's a massively false dichotomy, right? And COVID has sort of been something that has illustrated that to us a lot, especially us knowledge workers, right? But it's just, and I think that would be what I would love to see in a 21st century vision, right? Is the idea that, both of these things are true, right? And it's not that there are people who cook things and people who think things, people who wipe bottoms and people who make piles of money, moving bits around on the internet. Mm-hmm. But a dream, it's only a dream.
Yeah, so Haley, did you still have a question or you just the hand is up? Do you see this debate unfolding in the current discourse in sort of different parties being associated with suggesting that economic well-being is preeminent versus the fight for greater rights, for just policing, sort of reorienting the criminal justice system. These larger goals, some would argue, are secondary to prioritizing the economic well-being of African Americans, for instance. And I'm trying to, in a sense, represent the face of the battle as I'm understanding it. And so, it's often been quoted with President Trump. This is a stat that we've heard repeatedly, that some of his economic policies did in fact lead to higher Black employment, that the Black unemployment rate was the lowest it had ever been. And I remember seeing those stats myself and being intrigued. And so one wonders, are there trade-offs, and is it possible when we conceive of the progress of civil rights, is it possible that we should prioritize economic rights for marginalized, or economic progress for marginalized individuals, even if it means that in their day-to-day lives, there are going to be places where they may not feel as if they're being treated as equal citizens?
Wow, that's a big one, right? And I think that's really an individual thing, but I mean, it's like, what would you rather be? Would you rather be free or would you rather be rich? right? Would you rather have people be nice to you, treat you with dignity, or would you rather be rich? Right. And like, and to some extent, we have that in this country with, the richest African-Americans among us, right? Beyonce and LeBron James, right? They're rich, but they're also like, they're still, so they have what you're describing, this idea of having the economic success, whereas the rights or the way that they might be viewed or treated has not necessarily shifted because like, compared to W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T in like 1903, like they're living a life that is unimaginable to the African Americans of that era. I don't know what to think. It's fascinating.
Right. Even the NFL players, right? And I remember seeing this on Twitter, this comment that how could they really compare the NFL to a slave plantation if in fact many of the players are making millions of dollars, although many more perhaps making six figures, but definitely, they're not, they're economically better off than many African Americans. So how could you say that the NFL is like a plantation when quantitatively that is not the case in terms of the income of the players? And so that is how do you explain why that is problematic from that?
And too, like their experience of Haley brought up the realities of how racism manifests itself in the United States, right? And she was mentioning as one of her examples, criminal justice outcomes. And NFL players don't experience criminal justice outcomes the way that other Black men do, right? They have the same abilities that the rich white privileged people do to get out of trouble, right, with their money and their fame and their power. And so that's another way. It's like so their experience of racism is also different in that way.
Absolutely. Now, the notion of the talented 10th is a sort of a hidden premise of Du Bois's objection to Du Bois because, Booker T, because his idea was that, for those African Americans who are emerging out of slavery, there needed to be significant interventions in education, primarily education, but in sort of bringing them into modern culture and sort of sort of orienting them to middle-class life or just a good quality of life, really, and the elements of just a living in liberty and freedom. And so there needed to be, for the masses, the 8 million for the most part, this effort and intervention. But he truly believed that there could be a leading edge to this progress that was absolutely necessary. And these were, African Americans who received the best possible education in the liberal arts, and that their task would be to set the stage, as it were, and to frame the conversation that over time, more and more African Americans would be able to join. And some of the current people that come to mind that are part of this conversation is John McWhorter and Thomas Sowell and the like, and Glenn Lowry, right? They are academics for the most part, doing very well, but they disavow this liberal focus on anti-racism and argue that it is not truly contributing to African-American progress. And in many quarters, they are, highly valued for their interpretation. What would your response be to McWhorter's recent book, how woke racism, is harming African Americans? It's based on this very idea, right? That by the metrics of social mobility, African Americans are still struggling. So it seems like a terrible luxury to indulge in these constant battles for, middle class sort of rights that won't be a battle for most African Americans who are simply trying to get beyond working class status. Elizabeth, I see your hand again.
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating one to me as well, right? And I can only relate to it, in my own experience as a woman, and this feeling of like sometimes, you know, I get where they're coming from, this idea that it can undermine the talented when others, you know, sort of tap into the idea that, well, you know, we should have a woman do this. It's like, no, we should have a talented person do this. I'm a talented person. I happen to have 2 X chromosomes, but I'm a talented person. You know, so I understand that angle of it. And, you know, sort of from a visceral, personal standpoint. But I also think that there, you know, there's that other part that you tapped into a little bit with the idea of what are we fighting for, right? Because, you know, like Haley again brought up the example of criminal justice, and, you know, in many of the men that have been brought forth as faces of this movement are men that I don't want to have anything to do with, men that have been incredibly violent toward Black women, you know, and Black women have been lost in all of this. It's like, you know, they're the ones that, like, you know, who were George Floyd and, you know, James Blake menacing, you know, in their lives, right? Like, and so like, that's also something that, you know, I'm not articulating this very well, so my apologies to the group, but just this concern that, like, you know, who's getting lost when we focus on certain things. And, you know, and they talk about, you know, you're talking about Porter and his ilk talking about the talented, successful Black people getting lost, but another group that gets lost is Black women. You know, and I think that, you know, that issue of who gets lost is a fascinating one to me, and one that I turn over in my mind a lot.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, what constitutes progress, I think, is important. It's worth noting, again, that by far HBCUs such as Meharry Medical School are the ones who are generating the highest levels of graduates in STEM fields. So, you know, whereas we do want, you know, the achievement of Du Bois going to Harvard is, you know, and having many African Americans, you know, attend the most elite colleges, it's really important. But to what extent do we balance that accomplishment with simply turning out hundreds of thousands of very competent African Americans? I don't, you know, my own orientation, as you say, is I lean blue. I just don't get it mistaken here about my orientation. But however, these kinds of problems are ones that I think, you know, are worth exploring, if nothing less than to complicate our understanding of what it means to fight for social justice and social progress for marginalized people. Haley?
I have to bow out because I actually forgot that this was going to be a longer one. But that's not why I put my hand up. I'm not that self-important. So what I just wanted to, I guess, quickly say is that I think when we talk about the talented 10, at least, Booker T. Washington's expectation was that people would, you know, put a ladder down for other people to climb up with him. And I think, you know, while that does happen, I think that relies too much on individuals. Some of which, you know, because they've had so much success, don't necessarily see the systemic issues in the same way as someone who's more marginalized than them. And so I guess it's just one of those things where we just need systemic change so that we can have people, you know, rise up. Like I live in Atlanta right now. And we have some very, very, very wealthy people here, like extravagant meals, like $600 meals with like gold foil steak, even though gold foil is not that expensive to buy. Don't waste your money on gold foil. And yet at the same time, we have for all those, you know, for all those couples going on these really expensive, like having really expensive meals, having beautiful mansions. We have so many people who are homeless and suffering from issues like substance abuse, not being able to buy food, not being able to pay rent. And so we just need to be doing more on a systemic level rather than relying on a few talented people.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I love what Haley said about the issue about talented people reaching down to pull someone up, because I think that, you know, and I apologize, I'm not historically knowledgeable enough to know the personal value systems of either Booker T or W.E.B. Du Bois, but my guess is that they may have been shaped by Christian values, which you know, support that kind of thing. And capitalism is amoral; it has no values. And so, you know, in the absence of a value system, capitalism is not going to enforce or encourage or reward reaching down to pull someone up. There has to be a value system that does that. And it doesn't have to be a Christian value system, right? But it does have to be something other than capitalism.
Right. No, this is a good conversation. So my last slide is it wraps it up, but I would, before I do that, want to go back to the table of contents to see if perhaps there was some component of it that you wanted to focus on. Back to share my screen here. My recalcitrant PowerPoint. So going back to the table of contents. Say that one more time. Was there any other chapter that someone else wanted to call attention to? We could obviously spend many hours on this entire book, but I did just want to focus on the ones that, you know, have enduring themes that, you know, even today we're still grappling, with which we're still grappling today. The piece on the training of Black men, I think is really insightful, as he talks about some of the, for teachers, some of the kinds of pedagogies that we want to use to bridge the gap, right, between their experiences and higher learning. That's really moving. Is there any other chapter that any others really moving or compelling?
I would just like to make a comment that I really enjoyed the book immensely. As I say, it's amazing to me that the book is over 100 years old and yet still timely.
Very fresh.
You know, the chapter on Booker T. Washington, it seems to me that it's not a binary, it's not 0 and 1. There are some things that Du Bois is right about and some things that Booker T. Washington was also right about. His chapter on the black belt was interesting. I guess I was a little surprised that it was in Georgia that he talked about, because I think of the black belt as being in Alabama, but that really has to do with the soil in a certain part of Alabama, but also that there is a very large African-American population. And in fact, I was born in a black belt county in Alabama. I thought his chapter on the passing of his firstborn was extremely moving. You know, it almost brings you to tears. And his chapter on the sorrow songs it was very insightful, in as much as what you list the theme as Negro spirituals. You know, those are beautiful songs, and what I think of as gospel songs these days. I mean, that was one of the things that I enjoyed doing when I was in medical school. I listened to a gospel radio station as I went to school every morning, and it was a way to kind of fortify myself for the rigors of medical school. But this is just a comment generally about that. I thought the book was very enjoyable, and to me, still would be a great book to use to teach young people today. And with that, I'm going to have to sign off and go, because it's my dinner time.
Okay. All right. I thank you, Bill.
I
your...
want to say I enjoyed the presentation very much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for
You're
coming.
welcome. Bye, everybody.
So, yeah, this point is so well taken about the sorrow songs. And again, keeping in mind that part of his task as a sociologist is to posit the spaces of Black culture. And I think it was Anthony was pointing out that emerging out of slavery, what Black culture was to be was still undetermined, right? Or even underdetermined, or whether there was such a thing as Black culture. And so part of what Du Bois does is to, really present a hypothesis of what would it mean for us to define Black culture, and the sorrow songs would ultimately represent that. But the beauty about culture is that there's a universality that characterizes the components of culture, right? So we can all identify with music from many different cultures. We can find catharsis and connection and beauty. And so the sorrow songs as Negro spirituals is a quest for identifying, folk culture as a resource that is American. It's a part of American culture, even if it begins in the Black experience. And so there's so much of that he begins that process that would unfold in the Harlem Renaissance in the subsequent years. And this rich, imagine that jazz would then be formalized, and many different directions of art and music would then come out of the attempt of African Americans to say, even though we have a longing for Africa, and even though we don't know who our ancestors were, we identify with the American culture. We are not fully African, but we are African of the American soil. And so, and he really begins this process that many different theorists and philosophers will take up of articulating Black culture in the wake of 3 centuries of slavery, restoring a sense of humanity and dignity to a people, and the back and forth of that. But that is essentially all that I have. Thank you all for spending this time with me and discussing the souls of Black folk. You all were wonderful interlocutors, and it has been it's been a fun time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any last comments they want to make or anything for Dr. Fraser-Burgess?
I think for me, I would have to read this whole thing a couple more times. I just ordered my own book of it instead of the library. But the sense of a veil is, he was very clever, because we don't see Blacks often how they are. And when Booker T. Washington wrote that in September 8th, the Blacks had gotten the vote in the 14th and 15th Amendments by 1870. Something is amiss here, and something, at least I didn't know this consciousness. I was brought up in the North, because I had no idea about this other, and I very much liked it. He was right on. Thank you for taking the time to help us understand better. It's not easy in Muncie.
You're welcome. I'm sorry that we had such a short time, and but it certainly is a worthwhile conversation. And as is noted, these topics are so relevant. They explain where we are today. They help to unpack the sort of the Gordian knot of our society today, and why we're still struggling. So it's a very relevant work.
Right.
Okay, well, I think I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna stop the recording. Okay, there. So I'm gonna